So, I wanted to start off by talking, and for once, this is actually a pretty interesting topic that I'm going to be discussing. And the main reason it's so interesting is because I used to believe in a lot of this crap and shit. I used to be one of these MGTOWs, one of these INCELs, and I now have the ability to look back and reflect, and have had enough time to do the proper education and research that I'd like to present an argument on why I'm glad I left. So the biggest thing, of course, that I noticed was that it was like a cult for a lot of people. And I will touch on that further, but it really became this echo chamber of people who just, if you went against the grain by any means, you would be outed. So, let's go ahead and start on some of the points I want to argue against this group. So, the biggest and first part, again, like I said, is I used to be a part of it, and I know how addicting it can be to be a victim. If everybody and everything else is the problem and not you, then there's nothing you can do about it. But if you're the problem, then that means everything you know and were might have to be reevaluated. That's a lot harder than just blaming things outside of your control. Because if it's outside of your control, there's nothing you can do about it. Men in this group will argue that looks are the main factor. And for sure, this plays a major role, especially as looks are the initial first impression upon other people. We can see this with apps like Tinder. But it's over-exaggerated to an absurd degree. There are many other factors, such as personality, economic status, social class, etc. But these are often ignored in favor of saying that only the Chads get the Stacys. And these are just referring to the top percentages of men and women, in case you wondered what those are. People of similar attraction levels do tend to get together, which is why if you want better, then you should work out, dress nice, and conduct yourself in an attractive manner. It's also important to know what you're looking for. You might think this is obvious. I already know what I'm looking for. And what I see a lot is this two-sided coin. You hate or have distaste for women, but then want to date women. Not exactly a healthy mindset. Often what happens is there are underlying mental illnesses that have either been unaddressed, poorly handled, or they are unaware that they may even have any. These are in large part what prevents many from getting a partner. Along with this, reaching far out of their own league, be it financially, socially, or in the looks department as previously mentioned, while dismissing possible candidates of similar status in those fields. We have to compromise when picking a partner. And my biggest issue with MGTOW is it's not about getting better, it's about getting bitter. With many groups, such as MGTOW, acting as echo chambers to feel bad for oneself and talk about how wicked women are. But often, we find that it's not so much a gender problem, at least not entirely, but rather a cultural history. I think what the problem is that often they're looking for the wrong type of people to be with. You are a product of your environment. The most obvious answer is, if you don't like the hand you're dealt, then mulligan, get a new one. You cannot control how other people see you, or if they like you, but you can control yourself. There's this fundamental hurt from rejection, and rejection can feel like a rejection of the whole self, but it is a normal process of life. Be it rejected from a job before you find one that accepts you, going on dates, applying to college. By radically accepting it is what it is, we can begin to move forward. It's important to note that rejection doesn't just happen to you. It happens to all people, including these Chads and Stacys, you say. You miss 100% of the shots that you do not take. I think what's particularly offensive is these caricatures and stereotypes they create of women, and how many of them will slut-shame a woman, but by that double standard see themselves as admirable if they sleep with a lot of women. Their whole shtick is how to manipulate women, how to get an easy woman, etc., which creates broken, damaged women, who in turn create broken, damaged men. And so the cycle goes round and round. Some of their points is that women are shallow and only want men who are the top 1% or have a large bank account, or that they will divorce them and take half their stuff in court. There are absolutely shallow women, but there are also shallow men. If you're looking and if you're finding yourself constantly around shallow women, then you need to take a step back and reflect at the people and places you're around. People in MGTOW love to use the statistics on divorce and say it's always a woman's fault, without any evidence. There are many reasons for divorce, and even if the majority of divorces are initiated by women, this does not have an inherent negative implication. They'll say, oh, women only want a man who's ripped and 6 foot tall. And the question I ask is, why is that a bad thing? You think it's petty and shallow. Okay, cool, I can get behind that. But the most obvious answer then is move on. Why would you want a woman like that in the first place? Find someone who won't care about that. It's not just a woman problem either. How many times do you see these delusional incels talk about wanting a virgin, innocent woman who's not overweight? Where they often compare a woman who sleeps with others is to a bike or a car that has many miles on it. It's a preference. And so sometimes they'll say, oh, I can't change my height or anything. It doesn't matter. It's still a preference. Yes, granted, you cannot change your height. I totally agree with you. And yes, you can change how much you weigh. It's still a preference, though. And people are allowed to have preferences. So, something I think helps is to recognize that, right? And here's another thing that I've noticed. If you're not wanted by somebody, or if you're not welcomed in a certain area of life, then go where you're wanted. I know it's painful to go through rejection, and this shapes your beliefs, but this isn't cool. It's stupid. People use their personal experiences or others, but this is anecdotal evidence, which is not helpful. And seeing how people's experiences vary widely from person to person, we need something better than this, something more concrete. Which is why getting in these types of groups can be so bad to your growth. As previously mentioned, you get this echo chamber of people who are all saying the same thing. And if anyone speaks differently, they get ostracized from the group and dogpiled on. People crave a sense of community and belonging, so you have to just go along with it, or risk being on your own and lonely again. So even if you don't agree with all the points, it's easier to stay silent than to speak up. Even if speaking up is the right thing, because you found a family in this. Choosing to do nothing is still making a choice. You are, whether you like it or not, by default, on the side of the offender if you have the power to change it, and you do not act on it. You can say, oh, well, I'm just a bystander, but if everyone had this attitude in life, we'd remain stagnant. Many people throughout history have spoken up despite the risk of punishment, because they knew that somebody had to. You might think other people would do that, so you don't have to. Well, as we know, according to the bystander effect, that's exactly what everyone else thinks too. In fact, the more people, the larger the group, the less likely an individual is to do something, to take action, as they're expecting someone else to do so. What's bizarre about this is the idea is voluntary celibacy, going your own way. But many of them are quite the opposite. In fact, they lament about how no woman will sleep with them, and in their baby rage, scream out injustice. What of trans people? What of gay men? Nah, forget about them, because this isn't about getting better and lifting each other up. This is about hating women, because they're not this pure, innocent virgin slave who does whatever you want and fits the traditional role of what you believe a woman should be. They say women only pick chads, right? then where's the outrage at the other men? Oh, that's right. I forgot. It's not about men. It's about women. How come I never see any support for the gay men? They're never mentioned ever. Like, ever. These guys will talk about high-value men, this and that. But by their own standards, they are very low value. Can't keep a woman, and the women they do get are what they deem as sluts, dumb, gold diggers, etc. So, I would ask yourself honestly, if these are the type of guys you want to take relationship advice from, just listen to the venom and hurt from these guys. A woman hurt them, and they never took the time to process it and move on. And don't get twisted. It's okay to be hurt, but it's not okay to sit there and do nothing about it. What this really all breaks down to is incels who have convinced themselves they're alphas, when they're just selfish little beta incels. The example I have for you, and what I'm asking you, again, is why can't you go your own way without being so hateful? This should be about self-improvement. You can't improve yourself while you're being occupied by hating women. They're living rent-free in your head. You should be focused on yourself. And part of self-improvement is mental, not just physical. So you can go to the gym, which is great, but you also need to go see a therapist. Work through the anger. Now, if you're just fucking women, learning how to manipulate them, surrounding yourself with other douchebag bros, you're going to get around women who aren't the highest quality, which will only reinforce your delusions. Good women want good men. And doing all this shit I just mentioned is only going to attract the type of women you can't stand. If you want to know how to get a good woman, then you need to look at the guys who have been married 20, 30 years. Ask them how they did it, and how they keep their relationship strong. Stop taking advice from dudes who can't even do the things they claim. So going on to the accusation of wealth. Living alone, regardless of sexuality, anyone living alone may have more wealth simply because of the high cost of living or raising a family. However, given the right partner and proper financial decisions, two incomes can allow the household income to rise significantly and thus garner more wealth. So, living alone, that's the biggest argument they make, is that you should just live alone because you'll be able to keep more of your money and you won't have a gold digger. Well, again, first of all, you shouldn't even be with somebody like that in the first place. But if you have a partner, it can actually be more beneficial to have two incomes. And like I said, as mentioned, if you're really afraid of gold diggers, then you have to be careful about who you date. If it's about money, then God forbid that either partner ever gets in a sticky financial situation, because then you'll see that go right down the drain. Many in the MGTOW sphere will claim that finances are the most common reason for divorce. While it certainly can play a role, it is not the leading cause. What I also find particularly troubling about this is that it is implied that it must be the woman's fault by default, based on speculation, sexism, and stereotypes. A lot of the feelings that MGTOW believers have are found in bitterness and resentment. And in that, the mission statement is not like what it actually is saying. The words and actions are different that many speak. This isn't just a harm on women, but on the individual as well, because they are robbing themselves of the insight into why things aren't working that would allow them to improve their conditions and perhaps have better outcomes. Founded on this implied male birthright and privilege that dictates by default they have the right to have women reciprocate any and all feelings towards them. And should they not, this is taken much more personally than it should ever be. The rejection is, in their mind, an insult to them and an attack on their ego, rather than just the woman choosing, very politely, that they are not what they are looking for. Now, as you may know, I am a huge fan of psychology. I've researched and studied it for many years. And one field I'll see used a lot to justify the sexism is the field of evolutionary psychology. And I wanted to give credit to Cosmic She-Owl because I read a post on theirs that really beautifully explained stuff. In that post, they give an example about one fallacy that will be used as the natural fallacy, in which, because it is natural, it must be right. As we know, morals and science do not always go together. We have seen many scientific studies done on rats, done on humans, done on children. Like the Stanford prison experiment was great, where ethics had to come into play. When we approach things purely from a scientific standpoint, sometimes we can tend to become particularly monstrous, I would say, which is not always a great thing. So, back to that point, the argument of morals and science going together, which they don't. A great example would be those who are arguing women who try to kill the child due to postpartum depression should not be held accountable because animals do this too, for such things as when resources are low. Not only is this argument flawed because this is assigning human feelings and characteristics to an animal, and vice versa, which does not work due to both being radically different in terms of intelligence, modernity, etc. We also see this in the pseudo-altruistic family annihilators who will kill off kids when they are poor as a way of saving resources or, in their mind, saving them from the current circumstances. What I'm saying is natural and moral do not always go together. Just because something can be explained on why it's happening doesn't make it right. Another hard to swallow pill is that rape happens in the animal kingdom, and with humans since creation. That does not make it right just by virtue of being natural. There are many natural poisons as well in the world. However, should you consume them, you will most certainly die. I find it ironic that those in MGTOW will often call women sluts when, on average, they sleep with less partners. This is for many reasons, but since we like using evolutionary psychology as an explanation, one could be that for women, the act of sex implied a lot more responsibility and consequences than for the man, namely in the form of pregnancy and then raising the child. Now, that's not to say that men aren't there to provide, but that the level of implicit responsibility is different in terms of childbirthing, breastfeeding, caretaking, etc. And as mentioned, when we say studies on average, that has to be taken into account. The key word is on average here. Often, they'll read a study and then use it to apply blanket statements to everyone, which in turn ends in them forgetting about the individual. Some women like masculine guys, but some prefer femboys. In fact, on average, when we see women, they prefer men of average masculinity. But there are many that fluctuate heavily on the spectrum, and vice versa, many men prefer things like tomboys. So, a good example of this can be seen with the current femboy surge. I think it's also important to note that much of what's being said is through the lens of heteronormativity and does not factor in those who have different genders, sexes, sexualities, gender expressions, culture, and on. What is used as well to hate on women and stereotype them is the idea of hypergamy. Again, refer to the previous statements about taking into account the individual. But with that assumption, it can also be argued, then, that men may date younger and more attractive females than them, which is another form of hypergamy. It's hard to say definitively, and to pretend we have all the answers would be either lying or ignorant. It also comes down to a cultural issue as well, as previously mentioned. As financial and social status are big here in America, and especially due to capitalism, it's been theorized that with the last few decades, it was often done by women, as this was one of the few ways they had access to have even a taste of the same privileges men had. Historically speaking, women have not been able to hold their own bank accounts for very long, only being able to do so since the 1960s. However, it wasn't until 1974, when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed, that they were given the same rights in this area as men to not be discriminated based on their sex or gender. Earning their own income was also different for many reasons. The first one being that it was the culture. Even today, the idea of the man being the provider and the stay-at-home mother is still held as being the right way of doing things. The other issue, as proposed by scholars in the 1970s, such as Mahanadas, writes, is that if women were constantly marrying up, then their status would be to the point that few to no men would be above them. Which is where we get back to hypergamy, which is when women marry down. Whereas homogamy is marriage between people with similar characteristics and social statuses. We often see the argument of high-value men, which is a topic I'd love to touch on. Men are falling behind women in almost every field. Number of graduate degrees, school completion rates, and labor force participation. Hold that thought for just a second. Apologies for the interruption. For every 60 women now at college, there are 40 men. That's 50% more women than men. The modern MGTOW man today will complain about all the other men in chats, as if a lot of men means a lot of competition. Now this sounds like common sense, but the problem with the argument of common sense is this was the same argument that was used to justify slavery. It was just common sense to have a slave. But that doesn't mean it's right. Common sense, quote unquote, is constantly changing. The data does not lie. According to the University of Utah anthropologist Ryan Schott, reports in a recent issue of Royal Society Open Science, when there is an abundance of men, they tend to settle down. However, when there is a smaller number, acts such as promiscuity or having children outside of wedlock occurs more often with men. What men and women want also relates to at what point in life they're in, and also where they grew up, what they were taught, again with the culture, values, life experiences, and on. As such, we must be careful in making such broad statements. Really, MGTOW has become almost cult-like in nature, creating an us versus them dynamic, as if you could logically always be the good guys, as if you are above mistakes. Now, as we wrap up this sort of session here, I'd love to circle back to hypergamy real quick, seeing as this is used so much. This is actually decreasing more and more. One example, as I gave, is the education hypergamy. Now, it is predicted that by 2050, women in nearly every country, with the exception of a few African and West Asian countries, will have a higher form of education than men on average. Now, I've seen a lot of MGTOW individuals throughout research, but there's a few problems with it. First of all is misinterpreted information. You see this all the time. Another thing that happens is they'll look for information that confirms or reinforces their bias and assumptions. And back to that misinterpreted information, the argument of hypergamy. They misinterpret it, and they don't even know where it comes from. They poorly research it. So, like I said, they'll look for stuff that reinforces their bias and assumptions, while they ignore information that goes against it, such as the fact that hypergamy is actually decreasing. There's a lot more, but let's leave it at this. I'm going to leave the comments open. Now, I have no doubt I'll hear the same parroted stuff and be insulted. They love to do that. But because what idiots do is when they cannot argue your points, they go for your character. To me, I do not take it offensively because it's a clear sign that they lack the ability to be civil and use critical thinking skills. And just to be clear, I know it's not all who are in MGTOW that are like this. In fact, I'm hoping the large majority are not like this. But, much like modern feminism, what originally started out with a positive reputation and genuine concern for gender inequality and social issues has turned into hating the other sexes and genders, being bitter and upset, and blaming everyone and everything else around them. A true victim mentality, woe is me, I am powerless, to the circumstances and the villains of this story. Now, as mentioned, I'm always willing to have conversations on topics like this, but the biggest thing is I will not engage in any unproductive stuff. I have no doubt some people will see this, and they will not even consider what I have posted. They will be offended, they will dismiss it, they will ignore it, they will share it with their other dickhead friends, and they will comment and say toxic stuff. However, I hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And the thing I'm hoping for is that those who disagree with this will perhaps consider the points I am presenting forward and really maybe think about this. Again, I used to be big into the manosphere. I watched stuff like Better Bachelor, for example. He was a big one for me. So, I think if it's really about getting better, then stop spending so much time shitting on women. Stop spending so much time watching other men shit on women. It's supposed to be about you, the individual, and yet you're so caught up with women. Not a good idea. It's kind of like the whole thing of like communism, you know, how people say there's never been true communism practice, how countries that try to adopt communism sometimes, you know, they won't actually practice it like the way it's intended. So even though the mission statement, for example, of MGTOW has been going their own way, you're not actually practicing what it's supposed to be. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Bye now.